Did you know that Dr. Phil once tampered with evidence in a murder trial to frame an innocent man, slander a murder victim, and exploit the victim's family? Let's talk about it. In 2005, high school senior Natalee Holloway was in Aruba for a senior trip with her entire graduating class when she disappeared the night before she was set to return to the United States. If you're a millennial or older, you likely recognize Natalee Holloway's name because of the media frenzy that happened around the case at the time. Nancy Grace, Greta Von Susteren, all of the media ghouls wanted a piece of the story, none more so than Dr. Phil. But Dr. Phil was willing to go the extra mile, even if that meant outright lying or accusing an innocent man of a crime they did not commit. Now, to understand how deeply ghoulish what Dr. Phil did in the Natalee Holloway case was, you need to understand the basics of the case itself. So, briefly, Natalee Holloway was last seen in a car with a Dutch man named Joran, who she had met up with at a bar that night, along with two of his guy friends, brothers named Deepak and Satish. Immediately after her disappearance, investigators naturally zeroed in on the three men as possible suspects. Initially, all three men claimed that they had dropped Natalee off at her hotel and that they had seen her talking with two hotel guards as they left. Later, the brothers admitted that they had been lying to protect their friend Joran, and that they had actually dropped Joran and Natalee off at the beach together before driving home for the night. Cell phone tower records corroborated this version of the story, placing the brothers at home. Enter Dr. Phil. On September 15th, 2005, 3.5 months after Natalee was last seen, Dr. Phil featured Natalee's story on an episode of his show, inviting her mother on as a guest. Before the episode aired, the show promoted it as an expose, claiming, "You are going to find out what he," meaning Deepak, one of the brothers, "says he did with Natalee the night she disappeared. What he said brought Natalee's mother to tears." On the episode, Dr. Phil shows Natalee's mother for the first time hidden camera footage of Deepak being interviewed by one of Dr. Phil's polygraph experts, whom the show had sent to Aruba to obtain interviews with the suspects. In the video, Dr. Phil's employee asks Deepak whether Natalee had sex with all three men. Deepak appears to answer in the affirmative, saying, "She did. You'd be surprised how simple it was."
If it was an accident, I can help Paul. And if you guys were partying, even if somebody had given her a date drug, I'm sure she had sex with all of you. Be surprised how simple it was.
It's important to note that Dr. Phil chose to air the audio only from the interview, placed over still images of Deepak and the interviewer. This is important later. Well, this episode of Dr. Phil, particularly this hidden camera footage, was a bombshell. Everyone was shocked. Most of all, Aruban authorities, who were still actively searching for Natalee and who had not even been informed the tape existed until after the episode aired in order to protect Dr. Phil's scoop. In fact, years later, leaked emails between Dr. Phil and one of the show's producers showed them discussing the need to push taping of the episode earlier, regardless of what the polygraph expert got on camera the next day, in order to feature Natalee's story before Oprah could. Even after they had successfully scooped Oprah and aired this bombshell tape that no one else knew existed, the Dr. Phil show continued to play games and prioritize their own ratings over actually helping find Natalee. In fact, Aruban officials say that initially they were told that they could only have a copy of the bombshell tape if they went on the Dr. Phil show first. And once they were able to actually get a copy of said tape, well, things got a whole lot worse. Aruban officials were eventually able to get their hands on a copy of the bombshell tape, which, as aired, remember, appeared to show Deepak saying that Natalee had sex with all three men. But the tape, in context, did not appear to show that. In fact, the longer full version of the tape appeared to show the exact opposite. In the longer tape, Dr. Phil's polygraph expert can be heard saying, "I'm sure she had sex with all of you," to which Deepak responds, "No, she didn't," while shaking his head no side to side. In addition, when comparing the two videos' transcripts, it became very obvious that the Dr. Phil show had taken fragments of multiple different sentences and pieced them together as if they were one cohesive statement. While it is absolutely normal to edit video for clarity and time, what the Dr. Phil show did in this instance went far, far beyond that, in my opinion, as both a former journalist and a current digital strategist. Even if you were to extend the maximum amount of grace to the Dr. Phil show and assume that maybe they actually did mishear Deepak's words as she did, there's still the fact that when watching the actual video footage and not just listening to the audio, which Dr. Phil and his team absolutely would have watched the entire actual video, you can see that Deepak clearly shakes his head no, making it absolutely unambiguous what he was saying. But the Dr. Phil show, in their pursuit of ratings and scooping Oprah, still chose to broadcast worldwide that you are going to find out what Deepak says he did with Natalee the night she disappeared. Years later, Joran van der Sloot would finally admit that he was responsible for Natalee's death and disappearance, after the brothers, Deepak and Satish, had dropped both Joran and Natalee off together at the beach. Joran says that he and Natalee made out on the beach for a bit, but when he attempted to advance things physically, Natalee refused. Joran says that he became so enraged that he kicked Natalee in the face hard and then used a cinder block before dragging her body into the ocean. Natalee was only 18 years old. I think what I find particularly disgusting about Dr. Phil's actions in the Natalee Holloway case, especially now that we know what actually happened to Natalee, is that Dr. Phil didn't just grossly misrepresent or even tamper with evidence in order to defame an innocent man as a murderer. Although he absolutely did that, he also slandered Natalee by falsely leading his entire huge audience to believe that Natalee had sexual relations with the very man who, as it turns out, literally beat her to death because of her refusal to do so. But Dr. Phil's horrific exploitation of Natalee Holloway's life and death didn't even stop there. In December of 2006, 15 months after the Dr. Phil show had tampered with video footage to falsely accuse Deepak and his brother Satish of murdering Natalee Holloway, the brothers filed a slander and libel suit against Dr. Phil in the state of California. The case was initially set for trial in October of 2011, but was later pushed to April of 2015. Ultimately, the case was unfortunately dismissed on what I would argue amounts to basically a technicality. In the state of California, statute requires that a person officially request that a media outlet retract and correct any slanderous claims made against them. Only after the outlet has refused to do so for 20 days can a person sue them. The brothers, not being from the United States, much less from California, didn't know that. So they lost, and Dr. Phil walked away as the only person not hurt by his exploitative behavior in the case. And Dr. Phil has continued to exploit Natalee's life and death by finding ways to leverage her story to get himself more attention, more money, and more fame. Months after he aired the episode that defamed Deepak, Dr. Phil visited The Tonight Show with Jay Leno to float a salacious new theory that perhaps Natalee wasn't murdered at all and instead had been sold into sex slavery.
But, there is a huge sex slave underground in some of those countries down there. Young women have disappeared from that part of the world before, and we have reasonable cause to believe that she may well be alive.
Then, in 2018, Dr. Phil was back to claiming that Natalee was dead, only this time he suggested that perhaps she wasn't murdered at all. This theory was featured in an episode of Dr. Phil about 23-year-old Emily Heistad, who days earlier had stabbed her estranged ex-boyfriend to death after he attempted to kidnap her at gunpoint. You might be thinking to yourself, what the hell does Emily's story have to do with Natalee Holloway? Well, Emily's now dead ex-boyfriend was a man named John Ludwig, who claimed in a 2017 documentary by the Oxygen Channel that he had helped Joran cremate Natalee's body after an inebriated Natalee began seizing and foaming at the mouth while at the beach with Joran, subsequently passing away.
Did he tell you where Natalie's remains were? Do you believe he helped Joran or not?
I did at first. He had so many stories, all the stuff about crushing her skull.
Dr. Phil chose to air these claims in order to make Emily's story a more compelling episode of the Dr. Phil show, despite the fact that no evidence ever supported John Ludwig's claims. And in fact, DNA testing of bone fragments found where John Ludwig claimed they had disposed of Natalee's cremated remains showed that the fragments were not Natalee's at all. And from the moment that the Oxygen documentary following John Ludwig was first aired, Natalee's mother had been unequivocal about how upsetting she found its existence to be. She filed suit against the Oxygen Channel, alleging that the so-called documentary was scripted and outrageous fiction produced and published at the expense of her severe emotional distress. And yet, less than a year later, when Dr. Phil needed something, anything, to make a mediocre story more interesting for his audience, he had no problem giving it airtime. Please engage with this video to help it reach more people. It might sound crazy, but a lot of work went into making this, especially with how hard it was to actually find footage from that episode of Dr. Phil. The episode has been damn near scrubbed from the internet as a whole, I suspect at the specific behest of Dr. Phil, because he knows that the episode makes him look like the ghoul he is. So it took me several hours of searching to even find the clips that I could use for this video. And if you found this story interesting, or you want to hear more examples of why Dr. Phil is one of the worst humans to ever walk planet Earth, please be sure to follow me. I am by far Dr. Phil's #1 hater, and I have a damn near encyclopedic knowledge of all of the truly horrific things he's done over the course of his career, and I'll be sharing more of those stories in the coming days.